The pistol shot echoed through the dusty streets of Yreka, California, but Katherine Jenkins barely flinched as the bullet splintered the wooden post 6 inches from her head. It was the third time this week her husband had tried to make her look unstable in public, firing into the air or near her while she walked through town, then telling everyone who gathered that she had become hysterical over nothing at all. The year was 1878, and in this rough mining town nestled in the Shasta Valley, a woman's reputation was as fragile as creek ice in springtime. She stood perfectly still on the wooden sidewalk outside the general store, her basket of supplies clutched in steady hands, her blue eyes calm as mountain lakes. Around her, townspeople whispered and pointed, some shaking their heads with what looked like pity. Her husband, Malcolm Jenkins, rushed toward her with theatrical concern painted across his weathered features, calling out loudly enough for the growing crowd to hear every calculated word. "Katherine, darling, you must not have these episodes in public," he said, gripping her arm with fingers that would leave bruises beneath her long sleeves. "The doctor said you need to rest, that your nerves are too delicate for town visits." She met his gaze without wavering, seeing the cold calculation behind his false worry. "I was standing here peacefully, Malcolm. You fired that shot. There, you see?" He turned to address the gathered crowd, his voice dripping with manufactured sadness. "She imagines things that never happened. I have been across the street at the saloon this entire time. Ask anyone." 3 men nodded in agreement, and Katherine recognized them as Malcolm's regular card-playing companions. She had learned over the past 6 months that her husband had been systematically building a case against her sanity, bribing witnesses, staging incidents, and spreading rumors. What she had not yet discovered was why, though she suspected it had something to do with the land her father had left her before his death last winter. "Madam." A new voice cut through the murmuring crowd, deep and steady as bedrock. "I saw the whole thing from across the street. Your husband is the one who fired that shot." Katherine turned to see a tall man stepping forward from the shadowed overhang of the livery stable. He was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair that brushed his collar and eyes the color of aged whiskey. Dust covered his worn leather vest and denims, and a well-maintained Colt revolver hung at his hip. Everything about him spoke of someone who had spent more time under open skies than under roofs. "Who the hell are you?" Malcolm's theatrical concern vanished, replaced by naked hostility. "Xander Kane," the cowboy replied, touching the brim of his hat toward Katherine. "Just rode in this morning looking for work. Seems I arrived at an interesting time." Malcolm's face flushed dark red. "This is a family matter, stranger. Best you move along before you find trouble." Xander Kane did not move along. Instead, he looked directly at Katherine with an expression that held no pity, no judgment, only a clear-eyed assessment that saw her exactly as she was. "Madam, are you in need of assistance?" It was the first time in 6 months anyone had asked her that question while looking at her like she might be capable of answering truthfully. The first time anyone had not looked at her like she was made of cracked glass and confusion. Something in her chest loosened just slightly, like the first breath after being held underwater. "I would appreciate if someone would speak the truth about what they witnessed," she said carefully. "Then I will do so." Xander turned his attention back to Malcolm. "I watched you fire that shot from right where you were standing. I have no reason to lie about what I saw with my own eyes." The crowd's murmuring changed tone, uncertainty creeping into their whispers. Malcolm recognized the shift, and his expression hardened. "Katherine, we are going home. Now." "Actually, I still have shopping to complete." She pulled her arm from his grip, her heart hammering but her voice steady. "I will return when I'm finished." For a moment, Malcolm looked like he might strike her right there in front of everyone. But he seemed to remember himself in the audience watching. Instead, he leaned close and whispered, "You will regret this," before turning on his heel and striding toward the saloon. Katherine released a breath she had not realized she was holding. Her hands trembled now that the immediate danger had passed, and she gripped her basket tighter to still them. When she looked up, she found Xander Kane still standing there, studying her with those observant eyes. "Thank you, she managed. "That was kind of you." "It was truthful of me," he corrected gently. "There is a difference. Are you safe at home, Mrs. Jenkins?" The question was direct, and she appreciated that more than empty pleasantries. "For now. He needs me alive, at least until he finds a way to have me declared legally insane and take control of my inheritance." Xander's jaw tightened. "That happens more often than it should." "Yes, well, I do not intend to make it easy for him." Katherine straightened her shoulders. "I have documentation of everything stored somewhere safe, and I still have my wits, despite what he tells everyone." "I can see that clearly." Something like respect flickered across his weathered features. "Mrs. Jenkins, I meant what I said about looking for work. I am good with horses and ranch work. If you have need of a hand, I would be glad to help." She hesitated, knowing how such an arrangement might look to the town that already whispered about her supposed madness. But she also knew her small ranch was being run into the ground by Malcolm's deliberate neglect, and she needed help if she was going to maintain any independence at all. "I have a ranch 2 miles north of town," she said slowly. 20 acres with about 40 head of cattle. My husband takes no interest in maintaining it, and I cannot manage alone. The pay would be modest." "Fair pay for fair work is all I ask," Xander replied. "When should I start?" "Tomorrow morning, if you're able." Katherine felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. "There is a bunkhouse on the property. It needs cleaning, but it is sound." "Tomorrow it is." Xander tipped his hat again. "I will find my way. And Mrs. Jenkins, keep your documentation safe. Men like your husband do not stop unless they are forced to stop." Katherine nodded, appreciating his bluntness. She finished her shopping quickly, aware of eyes following her through town, and made her way to the wagon she had driven in that morning. As she guided the horses north along the dusty road toward home, she allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. For the first time since her father's death, someone had looked at her and seen sanity instead of the madness Malcolm painted across her reputation. The ranch house came into view as she crested the small rise, a sturdy structure her father had built with his own hands during the gold rush years. He had been one of the lucky ones who struck enough color to buy land and build something lasting. The cattle business had been profitable enough to live comfortably, and when he died, he had left everything to Katherine rather than to Malcolm, who he had never trusted despite accepting him as a son-in-law. That lack of trust had proven prophetic. Malcolm had married her 3 years ago when she was 22, presenting himself as a successful businessman interested in settling down. She had been charmed by his attention, naive enough to believe his pretty words, and her father had been too polite to voice his concerns until his final days. By then, she had already learned what kind of man Malcolm truly was, but divorce was nearly impossible and carried social stigma that could destroy a woman's life as thoroughly as any legal declaration of insanity. Katherine unhitched the horses and led them to the stable, noting with frustration that their water trough was nearly dry again. Malcolm had probably not filled it in days. She hauled buckets from the well until the trough was full, her arms aching by the time she finished. It was work that should have been done by a ranch hand, but Malcolm had run off the last worker months ago, claiming they could not afford the expense even as he spent their money on cards and whiskey in town. The house was empty when she entered, which was both a relief and a worry. Malcolm often stayed in town after his performances of public concern, drinking with his friends and complaining about his unstable wife. But sometimes he came home in dark moods, and those were the nights Katherine learned to make herself scarce or very, very quiet. She put away her supplies and began preparing a simple dinner, though she had little appetite. Her mind kept returning to Xander Kane and the way he had looked at her like she was a rational person worthy of being believed. It had been so long since anyone had offered her that basic respect. The town had slowly turned against her as Malcolm's campaign of whispered rumors and staged incidents accumulated. Even the doctor had begun to look at her with suspicion after Malcolm started spreading stories about her imaginary ailments and erratic behavior. The creak of boots on the porch brought her attention sharply to the door. Malcolm entered without the dramatic false concern he showed in public. Here, alone with her, he did not bother with pretense. "That cowboy has made things difficult," he said, pouring himself whiskey from the bottle he kept on the kitchen shelf. "But do not think one stranger's word will change anything. This town knows you are unstable. When the time comes, no judge will question having you committed." "Why are you doing this, Malcolm?" Katherine kept her voice level despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "If you want a divorce, we could arrange something quietly." He laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "And let you keep this land, the ranch? I do not think so. Your fool father should have left it to me, as was proper. But he wrote his will to leave everything to you, and California law says you control your own inheritance as a married woman." He took a long drink. "Unless you're declared incompetent, then it all comes to me as your husband and guardian. Legal and simple." "I will fight you," she said quietly. "I have been documenting everything." Malcolm's eyes narrowed. "Hidden somewhere clever?" "I am sure, but it will not matter. I have 3 doctors ready to testify to your deteriorating mental state. I have witnesses to dozens of your public episodes. What do you have? Paper that could disappear? The word of a woman everyone knows is mad?" He was right that her situation was precarious, but Katherine had learned to hide her fear behind a calm facade. "I have the truth. Eventually, that matters." Sweet, naive Katherine. Malcolm set down his glass with deliberate care. "The truth is whatever people believe, and I have spent 6 months teaching this town to believe you are insane. One drifting cowboy will not undo all my careful work." He left the room, and Katherine heard him climbing the stairs to the bedroom. She would sleep in the small guest room tonight, as she did most nights now. The marriage had been cold and distant for over a year since she had first discovered Malcolm's gambling debts and his real reasons for pursuing her. Sleep came slowly, and her dreams were uneasy tangles of whispered accusations and crowds of pointing fingers. She woke before dawn to the sound of roosters crowing and lay still for a moment, gathering her strength for another day of maintaining her careful composure. Xander Kane arrived at first light, riding a sturdy buckskin horse and leading a pack mule. Katherine watched from the kitchen window as he surveyed the property with an experienced eye, noting the sagging fence lines, the overgrown pasture, and the general air of neglect that hung over the place. When he saw her emerge onto the porch, he dismounted and approached with his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Jenkins," he greeted, "I am ready to start whenever you are ready to direct me." "Please, call me Katherine when we are on the ranch," she said, appreciating his formality but craving something more genuine. "And I would be grateful if you could start with the fence line on the eastern pasture. It needs significant repair before we lose cattle through the gaps." "I will see to it." Xander studied her face for a moment. "Did you have trouble last night after returning home?" The question surprised her with its directness and its concern. "Nothing I have not handled before." Malcolm made his position clear, but he did not do anything actionable. Xander's expression darkened. "A man who would gaslight his own wife and try to have her committed is capable of worse. You should know that." "I do know that." Katherine met his eyes steadily. "But I also know that running or showing fear will only make things easier for him. I have to stand my ground." "Then I am glad you are not standing it alone anymore." Xander put his hat back on and turned toward his horse. "I will get started on that fence. If you need anything, just call." Katherine watched him ride toward the eastern pasture, something warm unfurling in her chest at his words. Not standing alone anymore. Such a simple thing, but it had been so long since she felt like anyone was on her side. She spent the morning working in the vegetable garden, pulling weeds and checking the irrigation channels her father had cleverly designed to bring water from the creek. The physical work was satisfying, giving her hands something to do while her mind turned over her situation from every angle. Malcolm had been careful and patient in his campaign against her reputation, but he was also arrogant. That arrogance might be his weakness if she could find a way to exploit it. Around midday, she prepared a simple lunch and carried it out to where Xander was working. She found him stripped down to his shirt, his vest discarded in the shade, sweat dampening the fabric as he worked to replace a long section of rotted fence posts. He had made impressive progress, several posts already set and tamped firm. "I brought food," Katherine called out as she approached. "You must be hungry." Xander straightened, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "Thank you kindly. I worked up quite an appetite." He moved into the shade of a nearby oak tree, and she followed, setting down the basket she had brought. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Xander spoke again. "This ranch has good bones. Your father built something solid here." "He did," Katherine agreed, feeling the familiar ache of grief. "He loved this land. Worked it himself even after he could have afforded to hire it all done." "A man who understands cattle and land has a different way of moving through the world," Xander observed. "More grounded. Your husband does not have that quality." Malcolm came from back east, Boston originally. He came west looking for opportunities, which I suppose is common enough, but he never wanted to work the land. He wanted to own it and profit from it without getting his hands dirty. Xander took a long drink from his canteen. "What made you marry him, if you do not mind me asking?" Katherine considered how much to reveal. There was something about Xander's straightforward manner that invited honesty. "He was charming when he wanted to be. Educated, well-spoken, attentive. I was young and flattered by his interest. My father had concerns, but he did not forbid the match, and I thought I knew better." She looked out across the pasture. "I learned too late that charm can be a mask for uglier things." "Most hard lessons come too late," Xander said quietly. "That is what makes them hard." "What brought you to Yreka?" Katherine asked, wanting to shift the focus from her own mistakes. "I have been drifting for a few years now, working ranches from Montana down to Arizona territory. I like the work, and I like moving when a place starts to feel confining." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I had a ranch of my own once up in Oregon. Lost it during a bad winter when the cattle died and the bank would not extend credit. Since then, I have preferred working for others. Less to lose that way." "That sounds lonely," Katherine said softly. "It is," Xander admitted, "but it is also simple. No complicated ties, no one depending on you in ways you might fail." He looked at her directly. "Although I am beginning to think simple might be overrated." Something in his tone made Katherine's breath catch slightly, awareness sparking between them that was both exciting and dangerous. She was a married woman, regardless of how terrible that marriage had become, and she could not afford any hint of impropriety when Malcolm was already painting her as unstable and immoral. "I should let you get back to work," she said, standing quickly and gathering the lunch items. "Thank you for what you're doing here. It means more than you might realize." "Katherine." Xander stood as well, and the use of her given name sent another little spark through her. "I want you to know that I'm not just here for the work. What your husband is doing, it is wrong. If you need someone to stand witness or speak truth, I will do that." "Even though you only just arrived? Even though this town already has opinions about me?" she had to ask, had to understand why this stranger would involve himself in her troubles. "Especially because of that," Xander replied firmly. "I have seen what happens when good people stand by and let lies become truth. I will not be someone who looks away from injustice just because it is convenient." Katherine felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back firmly. She could not afford to cry, could not afford to show that kind of vulnerability even to someone who seemed kind. "Thank you," she managed. "That matters more than you know." She hurried back to the house, her heart beating hard in her chest. She had not expected to feel this way, had not anticipated that someone's simple decency would affect her so profoundly. But after 6 months of gaslighting and isolation, Xander Kane's steadfast belief in her sanity felt like water in a desert. The afternoon passed in routine work, and Katherine made sure to stay busy and visible. Malcolm returned from town in the late afternoon, his mood sour and his words sharp. He saw Xander working on the fence line, and his expression darkened further. "Who authorized you to hire a ranch hand?" he demanded, confronting Katherine in the kitchen. "I own this ranch," she replied calmly. I am authorized to make decisions about its operation." "You are not competent to make such decisions," Malcolm shot back, "and we cannot afford unnecessary expenses." "The fence was failing, and we would have lost cattle. That is not unnecessary. That is basic ranch management. And the expense is minimal compared to the value of the livestock." Katherine kept her voice level and reasonable, refusing to be baited into the kind of emotional response Malcolm could later twist into evidence of instability. Malcolm's jaw clenched. "I want him gone." "That is not your decision to make." Katherine turned back to the vegetables she was preparing for dinner. "If you want to discuss ranch business rationally, I am willing to do so. If you want to continue trying to undermine my competence, you can leave this kitchen." For a moment she thought he might explode into violence, but Malcolm seemed to master himself with visible effort. "You are making a mistake," he said coldly. "Every action you take just gives me more evidence of your unstable judgment." He left the house, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Katherine's hands shook as she continued cutting vegetables, but she forced herself to breathe slowly and maintain her composure. She had learned that showing fear or distress only encouraged Malcolm's worst behaviors. The days fell into a new pattern over the following weeks. Xander worked the ranch with quiet competence, repairing what had fallen into disrepair and slowly bringing the property back to productive standards. Katherine found herself looking forward to their brief conversations during lunch or when she brought him water during the hot afternoons. He treated her with consistent respect, never looking at her with suspicion or pity, always speaking to her like she was fully capable and sane. Malcolm, meanwhile, escalated his campaign. He staged another public incident in town, this time claiming Katherine had become hysterical and violent at home, showing bruises he said she had inflicted. Never mind that the bruises were on his knuckles, consistent with him hitting something or someone rather than being attacked. The town's whispers grew louder, and Katherine felt the walls closing in. "People are talking more," she told Xander one afternoon as they sat in the shade of the barn, watching storm clouds build over the mountains to the west. "Malcolm is winning." "He is louder," Xander corrected. "That is not the same as winning, and you have something he does not have." "What is that?" "The truth, and at least one person willing to testify to it." Xander looked at her seriously. "I have been asking around town carefully. Your husband has debts. Serious gambling debts to some dangerous men. That is why he is pushing so hard to get control of your inheritance now. He needs the money or he is in real trouble." Katherine absorbed this information, pieces clicking together. "If he is that desperate, he will become more dangerous." "Yes," Xander agreed bluntly, "which is why we need to be strategic. Do you still have that documentation you mentioned?" "Hidden safely, yes. Records of the staged incidents, witness statements that contradict his claims, financial documents showing his gambling losses." "Good. We need to bring it all to light, but we need to do it in a way that protects you legally and physically." Xander was quiet for a moment, thinking, "There is a federal marshal I knew years ago who settled in Redding. He is a fair man, honest. If we could get your case in front of him rather than the local authorities who Malcolm has been influencing, we might have a chance." "Redding is 2 days' ride from here," Katherine said slowly. "Malcolm would notice if I left." "Then we need to be clever about it." Xander met her eyes. "Are you willing to take the risk?" Katherine thought about spending the rest of her life locked away in an asylum, declared insane by a system that gave husbands far too much power over their wives. She thought about her father's legacy being squandered by Malcolm's gambling. She thought about the past few weeks working alongside Xander, feeling like herself again, feeling seen and believed. "Yes," she said firmly, "I am willing." They made their plans carefully over the next few days. Katherine would tell Malcolm she needed to visit her aunt in Redding, a reasonable excuse since she had not seen her in over a year. Xander would travel separately, meeting her there with the documentation. They would present everything to the marshal together, making a formal complaint and requesting legal intervention. The night before she was supposed to leave, Malcolm came home drunker than usual, his mood vicious. Katherine tried to stay out of his way, but he cornered her in the hallway upstairs. "You think you are so clever," he slurred, grabbing her wrist hard enough to hurt. hiring that cowboy, making your little plans. But you are nothing without me. Nothing. When you are locked away in the asylum, no one will remember you ever existed. Let go of me, Malcolm. Katherine kept her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. Or what? You will have me arrested? Who would believe you? He laughed, the sound ugly. You are already insane in everyone's eyes. I made sure of that. He shoved her backward, and Katherine stumbled but caught herself against the wall. Malcolm stared at her with glassy hatred before turning and stumbling into the bedroom, slamming the door behind him. Katherine waited until she heard him collapse onto the bed, then quietly made her way downstairs. Her hands were shaking as she poured herself water from the pitcher, trying to calm her racing heart. Through the window, she could see lamplight in the bunkhouse where Xander stayed. The sight was oddly comforting, a reminder that she was not completely alone in this. A soft knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Xander standing there, concern etched across his features. I heard shouting, he said quietly. Are you all right? He is drunk and angry, but I am unharmed. Katherine realized she was still trembling and clasped her hands together, just frightened. Let me stay in the house tonight, Xander said. I can sleep in the parlor, just in case. It was improper, potentially scandalous, if anyone found out, but Katherine found she did not care. Yes, please, I would feel safer. They settled into the quiet house together, Xander making a bedroll on the parlor sofa while Katherine retreated to the guest room she had been using. But sleep would not come. She lay awake listening to the house creak and settle, her mind churning with fears and plans and the awareness that just one room away Xander was keeping watch. Finally, unable to bear the solitude of her thoughts, she rose and padded quietly downstairs. Xander was awake, sitting by the window watching the moonlit yard. Could not sleep either, he asked softly as she entered. There was too much turning in my mind. Katherine sat in the chair across from him, pulling a shawl around her shoulders against the night chill. I keep thinking about all the ways this plan could go wrong. It might, Xander admitted, but doing nothing guarantees Malcolm wins. At least this way you're fighting. Why are you doing this? Katherine asked the question that had been building in her for weeks. You could have just kept riding when you saw me in town that day. This is not your fight. Xander was quiet for a long moment, moonlight casting shadows across his face. I told you I had a ranch once. What I did not tell you was that I had a wife too. Sarah was her name. He paused, old pain flickering in his eyes. She got sick that bad winter, fever that would not break. I tried everything, but the doctor was 3 days away, and by the time I got her to him, it was too late. She died while I was trying to save the ranch, and I have never forgiven myself for not putting her first. I am sorry, Katherine said softly. That must have been terrible. It taught me what matters and what does not. Land, money, pride. None of it means anything compared to people, compared to doing the right thing when someone needs help. He looked at Katherine directly. When I saw you in town that day, I saw a woman who needed someone to stand with her. I could not walk away from that. Not again. Something shifted between them in that moment, a deepening of connection that went beyond gratitude or simple friendship. Katherine recognized it and feared it and wanted it all at once. She was still married, still trapped in an impossible situation, but her heart did not seem to care about the legal and social complications. Xander, she began, not sure what she wanted to say. I know, he interrupted gently. I know all the reasons this is complicated, but I also know what I feel, and I think you feel it too. When you are free of him, when this is over and you are safe, we can figure out what comes next. Together. You would wait for me? The question came out barely above a whisper. Katherine, I would wait as long as it takes. His voice was quiet but absolutely certain. You are worth waiting for. Tears slipped down her cheeks, and this time she did not try to stop them. They were not tears of fear or despair, but of relief and hope, and something tender she had almost forgotten how to feel. Xander moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "We will get through this," he promised. "You are the sanest, strongest person I have ever met, and Malcolm Jenkins is about to learn he picked the wrong woman to try to break." Katherine leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, a gesture of intimacy and trust. They stayed that way for a long moment, breathing together in the quiet house, gathering strength from each other for the battle ahead. The trip to Reading nearly did not happen. Malcolm woke the next morning suspicious and hostile, questioning why Katherine suddenly wanted to visit her aunt. But Katherine had spent weeks preparing her story, mentioning the aunt repeatedly in casual conversation, laying groundwork. She showed Malcolm the letter she had carefully written and had a friend in town post back to her, the aunt's supposed invitation and concern. "You will come back more addled than you left," Malcolm finally said, "but fine, go visit your aunt. It will not change anything." Katherine packed a small bag and took the stagecoach from town, very aware that Malcolm was watching to make sure she actually left. Xander had departed the day before on horseback, circling wide to avoid being seen traveling with her. They had agreed to meet at a boarding house in Reading owned by a widow Xander knew and trusted. The stage journey was long and uncomfortable, but Katherine barely noticed. Her mind was fixed on what lay ahead, the confrontation that would determine her entire future. She carried the documentation hidden in a false bottom of her travel bag, months of careful record-keeping that represented her only real proof against Malcolm's lies. Reading was larger than Yreka, a bustling town that had grown fat on gold rush money and the railroad. Katherine found the boarding house easily enough, a neat two-story building with a kind-faced older woman answering the door. "You must be Katherine," the woman said warmly. "Xander told me to expect you. Come in, dear. You look exhausted." "Thank you, Mrs. Kimball." Katherine followed her inside gratefully. "Xander is waiting in the back parlor. I will bring you both some coffee." "Mrs." Kimball patted her arm. "And do not worry. Whatever trouble you are in, Xander is a good man to have on your side." Katherine found Xander in a comfortable room filled with afternoon sunlight. Relief flooded through her at the sight of him, solid and real, and exactly as steadfast as she had trusted him to be. "You made it safely," he said, standing as she entered. "Any trouble?" "Malcolm was suspicious, but ultimately let me go. I think he believes I'm no real threat without proof, and he does not know I have documented everything." Katherine set down her bag. "Did you speak with the marshal?" "I did. Marshal Thomas Blackwell. An honest man from what I can tell. He agreed to meet with us tomorrow morning at his office. He seemed concerned when I outlined the situation. So we present everything tomorrow and hope he takes it seriously enough to act." Katherine felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. Xander moved closer, his presence steadying. "He will take it seriously. You have documentation, credible testimony, and the law on your side. California allows married women to control their own property. Malcolm has no legal right to have you committed against your will without strong medical evidence, and his staged incidents are not that." "I hope you are right." Katherine sat down heavily. "I am terrified, Xander. If this does not work, if Malcolm finds out what we are trying to do." "Then we move to the next plan," Xander said firmly. "But Katherine, you need to believe you deserve to be free of him. You need to believe you are worth fighting for." She looked up at him, seeing the conviction in his face. "When did you become so important to me?" she asked softly. "Probably about the same time you became essential to me." Xander crouched beside her chair. "I know the timing is terrible, and the circumstances are impossible, but I need you to know something. When this is over, I want to court you properly. I want to know everything about you. I want to build something real with you if you will have me." "Yes," Katherine said without hesitation. "When I am free, yes to all of that." He smiled, and it transformed his usually serious face into something warm and wonderful. "Then we have even more reason to make sure this works." They spent the evening going over every piece of documentation, organizing it into a coherent timeline that showed Malcolm's deliberate campaign of manipulation and lies. Mrs. Kimball brought them dinner and tactfully left them alone, seeming to understand the gravity of what they were attempting. That night, Katherine lay awake in her rented room, anxiety and hope warring in her chest. Tomorrow would determine everything. Tomorrow she would either begin the process of reclaiming her life, or she would lose everything trying. Marshall Blackwell's office was in a solid brick building near the town center. He was a man in his 50s with silver threading his dark hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He listened intently as Katherine and Xander presented their case, asking occasional pointed questions and examining the documentation with careful attention. "Mrs. Jenkins, these are serious accusations against your husband," he finally said, "but I have to say your evidence is compelling. These financial records show significant gambling debts and fraudulent transfers of funds. This timeline of incidents shows a clear pattern of manipulation, and Mr. Kane here is willing to testify as an eyewitness to at least one staged incident. So you believe me?" Katherine hardly dared to hope. "I believe there is enough evidence to warrant a formal investigation," Marshall Blackwell said carefully. "I can issue a temporary injunction preventing your husband from taking any legal action against you or accessing your property until the investigation is complete. That will protect you legally. However, I want to be clear that this will likely infuriate him, and angry men can be dangerous." "He is already dangerous," Katherine replied, "but at least this way I have legal protection. I will also send a deputy to Yreka to inform the local sheriff of the situation and make sure he understands this is now a federal matter." Marshall Blackwell began writing official documents with brisk efficiency. "Mrs. Jenkins, I admire your courage in coming forward. Too many women in your situation feel they have no recourse." "I almost did not," Katherine admitted, "but I had help believing I was worth fighting for." The marshal glanced between her and Xander, a knowing look crossing his face. "Well, you chose your allies well. Mr. Kane, I will need you to make a formal statement about what you witnessed. Can you stay in Reading a few more days?" "As long as needed," Xander confirmed. They spent the next 2 days working with the marshal, giving detailed statements and signing official documents. Katherine felt like she could breathe fully for the first time in months, the legal protections forming a shield between her and Malcolm's machinations. But she also knew this was just the beginning. Malcolm would not accept defeat easily. The explosion came a week after she returned to Yreka. Malcolm stormed onto the ranch in a rage, a deputy following behind him looking uncomfortable but determined. "You conniving witch!" Malcolm snarled, his face purple with fury. "You went behind my back to a federal marshal? You tried to destroy me?" "I protected myself," Katherine replied, standing on her porch with Xander beside her. "I documented your attempts to steal my inheritance through fraud and false testimony." "Mr. Jenkins, I need you to calm down," the deputy said firmly. "There is an injunction in place. You cannot threaten your wife or access any of the marital property until the investigation is complete." "This is my home!" Malcolm shouted. "Actually, it is Mrs. Jenkins's property through inheritance," the deputy corrected. "The marshal has ordered you to remove yourself from the premises immediately. You can take personal belongings only. Everything else remains under Mrs. Jenkins's control." Malcolm's gaze swung to Xander with pure hatred. "This is your doing. You poisoned her against me." "No one had to poison me against you, Malcolm," Katherine said coldly. "You did that yourself with your lies and your cruelty. Now leave. You are no longer welcome here." For a moment, Malcolm looked like he might do something violent, but the deputy's hand on his gun stopped him. "Mr. Jenkins, do not make this worse. Gather your things and leave peacefully." It took an hour for Malcolm to pack his belongings, during which he alternated between rage and attempts at manipulation, trying to convince Katherine she was making a terrible mistake. She stood firm, Xander a steady presence at her side, and watched as her husband finally left the property that had never really been his. When the dust settled and Malcolm's wagon disappeared down the road, Katherine felt something unknot in her chest. She turned to Xander, and without thinking threw her arms around him. He held her carefully, respectfully, but she could feel the strength in his embrace. "It is not over yet," she said into his shoulder. There will still be legal proceedings, testimony, judgment. But you are safe now, Xander replied, and that is what matters most. The investigation took 3 months, during which Marshal Blackwell meticulously documented Malcolm's fraud, his gambling debts, and his systematic campaign to have Katherine declared insane so he could seize her property. Witnesses came forward, including a doctor Malcolm had tried to bribe into giving false testimony about Katherine's mental state. The evidence was overwhelming. The legal judgment was decisive. Malcolm was found guilty of fraud and attempted coercion. Katherine was granted a divorce on grounds of cruelty, a rare but justified decision. Her property and inheritance were confirmed as solely hers, and Malcolm was ordered to pay restitution for funds he had misappropriated. He left California in disgrace, his schemes exposed, and his reputation destroyed. Through it all, Xander stayed on the ranch, working the land, and waiting patiently for Katherine to heal from her ordeal. He never pressed for more than she was ready to give, content to build friendship and trust before anything deeper. Katherine found herself falling in love with him gradually, in quiet moments of shared work and easy conversation, in the way he looked at her like she was capable and strong, in his steady presence that asked nothing but offered everything. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, on a clear autumn evening with the mountains painted gold by setting sun, Xander finally asked the question they had both been waiting for. "Katherine Jenkins, I know we have been through hell to get here, and I know you have every reason to be cautious about trusting anyone again," he said, taking her hands as they stood on the porch of the ranch house. "But I love you. I have loved you since the day I saw you standing calm in the face of your husband's cruelty, refusing to break. I want to spend my life with you, building something good on this land your father loved. Will you marry me?" Katherine looked at this man who had believed in her when no one else would, who had stood beside her through the worst of her troubles, who had waited patiently for her to be ready. Her heart, which she had thought might be too damaged for love again, felt suddenly light and full. "Yes," she said, smiling through happy tears. "Xander Kane, I will absolutely marry you." He kissed her then, soft and reverent, and Katherine felt like she was finally home, not just in the physical place her father had built, but in the safety of being truly seen and loved by someone who knew her at her worst and her best. They married in spring of 1879, a simple ceremony in Yreka with Mrs. Kimball traveling from Reading to attend and the town's new doctor serving as witness. The same town that had once whispered about Katherine's supposed madness now murmured about her remarkable recovery and her good fortune in finding such a solid man. Katherine did not bother correcting them, did not waste energy explaining she had never been mad in the first place. She had learned that living well was the best response to those who had doubted her. Xander brought new life to the ranch, expanding the cattle operation and building relationships with buyers throughout Northern California. Katherine managed the books and the household with the same calm competence she had shown through her darkest days. Together they built something profitable and sustainable, a partnership in work and life. 2 years after their marriage, Katherine gave birth to a son they named Jacob after her father. Xander held the baby with wonder in his eyes, this tiny person they had created together, and Katherine felt her heart might burst with the fullness of it. She had gone from isolation and gaslighting to this warmth, this family, this beautiful, ordinary life where she was believed and loved. A daughter followed 2 years later, born during a summer thunderstorm that rattled the windows and made the cattle restless. They named her Sarah for the wife Xander had lost, and he wept when he held her for the first time. Katherine understood that he was grieving and celebrating simultaneously, honoring his past while embracing his future. The children grew sturdy and strong, learning to ride almost before they could walk, helping with ranch chores as soon as they were able. Katherine taught them to read using the books her father had collected, and Xander taught them about cattle and horses and reading the weather in the mountains. They were building a legacy, roots going deep into the California soil. Malcolm disappeared into history, last heard of in Nevada working as a clerk and nursing grievances about the wife who had outsmarted him. Katherine rarely thought of him anymore. He had been a dark chapter in her life, but he had also inadvertently led her to Xander, to this life she loved, to understanding her own strength. She could not quite be grateful for the suffering, but she could acknowledge how it had shaped her. Years passed in the steady rhythm of ranch life, seasons turning from green spring to golden summer to russet autumn to quiet winter and back again. Katherine and Xander grew older together, their love deepening from the passionate intensity of new romance into something richer and more complex, woven through with shared history and mutual respect and the thousand small intimacies of a life built together. On a summer evening when Katherine was 45 and Xander 47, they sat on the porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Jacob had married a girl from town and built a house on the western edge of the property. Sarah had inherited her mother's head for numbers and her father's way with horses, running the ranch business with confident efficiency. "Did you ever imagine this?" Katherine asked, leaning against Xander's shoulder as they rocked gently in the evening breeze. "That day in town when you stood up for me, did you imagine it would lead here?" "I hoped," Xander admitted, "but hope and certainty are different things. I knew you were special, though. I knew you were worth standing beside." "You saved my life," Katherine said softly, "not just from Malcolm, but from losing myself. You saw me when I was invisible to everyone else." "You saved yourself," Xander corrected gently. "You fought for yourself, documented everything, had the courage to take action. I just stood witness to what was already true, that you were the sanest person in town, and everyone else was mad for not seeing it." Katherine smiled at the memory of those dark days, now distant enough to seem almost unreal. "We have built something good here, you and I." "The best thing I've ever been part of," Xander agreed. "Better than I ever dreamed I deserved." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Their grandchildren's laughter rang across the yard, a sound that spoke of continuity and future, of the family they had created from the ashes of Katherine's first disastrous marriage. Inside the house, Sarah was preparing dinner, and the smell of fresh bread drifted through the open windows. Jacob was repairing a saddle in the barn, teaching his oldest son the craft. This was legacy in its truest form, not just property and money, but skills and values passed down through generations. "I love you," Katherine said, because even after all these years, the words still needed saying. "Every day I am grateful you walked into my life." "I love you too," Xander replied, kissing the top of her head. "You are still the most remarkable person I know, Katherine Kane." She smiled at her married name, so different from the one she had carried during those terrible months when Malcolm tried to destroy her. That woman, Katherine Jenkins, had been strong but alone. Katherine Kane was strong and beloved, surrounded by family, rooted in land she had defended and kept. As twilight deepened into night and the first stars appeared above the mountains, Katherine felt the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. She had survived betrayal and gaslighting, had fought for her sanity and her inheritance, and had found love in the most unexpected place. She had raised children who were good people, had built a thriving ranch, and had grown old beside a man who saw her clearly and loved her completely. The Wild West was changing, slowly becoming less wild with each passing year. The railroad had brought more people, more law, more civilization to places that had once been rough and lawless. But here on this ranch in the shadow of the mountains, Katherine felt connected to something timeless. The land her father had claimed, the cattle that bore her brand. The family gathered under her roof, these were the things that mattered. "Time for dinner," Sarah called from the doorway, and Katherine and Xander rose from their chairs, moving with the slower pace of age, but no less surely. They joined their family around the long table Xander had built 20 years ago, everyone talking and laughing, passing dishes and sharing news of their days. This was happiness, Katherine thought as she looked around the table at these faces she loved. Not perfect, not without challenges, but real and solid and hers. She had fought for this, had refused to let Malcolm's lies become her truth, and the life she had built in the aftermath was worth every difficult moment. After dinner, when the dishes were washed and the grandchildren were being tucked into bed, Katherine and Xander took their customary evening walk around the property. It was something they had done for years, checking fences and animals, but mostly just being together in the quiet. "I was thinking we should expand the cattle operation next year," Xander said as they walked. "Sarah has some good ideas about new breeding stock." "She has your instincts for the work," Katherine replied, "and she is fearless about innovation. I think we should support whatever she proposes." "Agreed." Xander squeezed her hand. "It is good seeing the next generation taking over. Makes everything we built feel more permanent." They reached the top of the small rise that overlooked the ranch buildings, and Katherine paused to take in the view. Lamplight glowed in windows, smoke curled from chimneys, and she could hear the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. This was her kingdom, earned through suffering and defended through courage, and now passing into the capable hands of her children. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if things had gone differently?" Katherine asked. "If Malcolm had succeeded in having me committed?" "Sometimes," Xander admitted, "and it makes me angry all over again. But mostly I'm just grateful things turned out this way, that you were strong enough to fight, and that I showed up at the right time to help." "Divine timing," Katherine mused, "or just extraordinary luck." "Or maybe just proof that sometimes the universe gets it right," Xander suggested. "Maybe we were always meant to find each other, meant to build this life together." Katherine leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. "I like that idea, that even through the worst of it, we were moving towards something good." They stood together watching the stars emerge fully, the Milky Way spreading across the black sky like spilled cream. Out here, far from town lights, the heavens were brilliant and vast, a reminder of how small their troubles were in the grand scheme of things, but also how precious this small corner of existence they had carved out for themselves. "Ready to head back?" Xander asked eventually. "Yes, I am ready." Katherine took his hand, and they walked back toward the house together, two people who had found each other in difficult circumstances and built something lasting. The years that followed continued in the same pattern of seasons and growth. The ranch prospered under Sarah's management, and Jacob's sons grew into capable cowboys. Katherine and Xander grew older, their hair turning silver, their movement slower, but their minds still sharp, and their love undiminished. They celebrated births and mourned deaths, weathered droughts, and rejoiced in good years, dealt with the changing times as the Wild West gradually transformed into something more settled and civilized. Through it all, they remained each other's anchor and compass, the partnership they had forged in crisis proving equally strong in peace. Katherine never forgot the lessons of those dark months with Malcolm. She made sure her daughters and granddaughters knew they had rights, knew how to document evidence, knew they should never accept gaslighting or abuse. She quietly helped other women in town who found themselves in similar situations, offering advice and support and sometimes financial assistance to escape dangerous marriages. Xander supported this work fully, understanding that Katherine needed to transform her suffering into something meaningful. Together, they became known as people who could be counted on to stand for justice, to believe women who were not believed elsewhere, to offer sanctuary to those who needed it. On Katherine's 60th birthday, the whole family gathered for a celebration. 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren filled the house with noise and laughter. Xander gave a toast that made her cry happy tears, talking about her strength and beauty, and how she had made his life infinitely richer. "To Katherine," he said, raising his glass, "the woman who refused to be broken, who built an empire from threatened ruins, who taught us all what courage really means, I am the luckiest man alive to call her my wife." "To Katherine," everyone echoed, and she felt overwhelmed by the love in the room, by the family she had created despite every obstacle. Later, when the party had wound down and most people had gone to bed, Katherine and Xander sat alone by the fire. She was tired but content, full of good food, and surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything. for believing me when no one else did, for waiting while I healed, for building this beautiful life with me. Katherine, you never have to thank me for loving you, Xander replied. It has been the easiest, most natural thing I have ever done. She kissed him then, soft and sweet, a kiss that spoke of decades together and many more yet to come. When they finally went to bed, climbing the stairs slowly and carefully, Katherine felt profoundly grateful for her life, for this man, for the twist of fate that had brought them together. The final years passed gently. Xander died peacefully in his sleep at 72, and Katherine mourned him deeply but without regret. They had been given 37 years together, 3.5 decades of partnership and love, and she treasured every memory. She wore his wedding ring on a chain around her neck and talked to him often as she went about her daily routines. Katherine lived to 86, sharp-minded to the end, still managing the ranch books and offering advice to her great-grandchildren. When she died on a spring morning with cherry blossoms drifting past her window, she went peacefully, surrounded by family, her last words a whispered, "I love you," directed at the memory of Xander. They buried her beside him on the rise overlooking the ranch, under a spreading oak tree. Her gravestone read simply, Katherine Kane, 1853-1939, beloved wife, mother, grandmother. She knew her own mind and defended it fiercely. The ranch continued through the generations, each adding their own chapters to the story Katherine and Xander had begun. But those who knew the history never forgot the woman who had refused to be gaslit into insanity, who had fought for her inheritance and her sanity, who had found love with a cowboy who saw her clearly when the whole town saw her as mad. It became a family legend told to each new generation. The story of how great-grandmother Katherine had been strong enough to survive a husband's cruel manipulation, how a stranger named Xander Kane had believed her when no one else would, and how together they had built something lasting and good from the ashes of betrayal and lies. The lesson endured, that truth matters, that believing people matters, that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes love arrives exactly when it is needed most. Katherine and Xander's story became a touchstone for their descendants, proof that even in the hardest circumstances, integrity and love could prevail. And on quiet evenings when the lights slanted golden across the California mountains, when cattle lowed in the distance and children played in the yard, people said you could still feel their presence on the ranch, not as ghosts exactly, but as the foundation upon which everything else was built. Two people who had stood together against injustice, who had chosen each other against all odds, and who had created a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. The Wild West had been a hard place, especially for women, but Katherine Kane had proven that even in that harsh landscape, truth and courage could forge a path to happiness. She had been called crazy, had been gaslit and isolated, but she had never lost sight of her own sanity. And when a cowboy had recognized that sanity and stood beside her, together they had changed not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone who came after them. It was a love story forged in fire, tested by betrayal, and proven through decades of partnership. It was the story of how Katherine Jenkins became Katherine Kane, how a woman fighting for her sanity found a man willing to defend it, and how together they built a life that stood as testimony to the power of truth and love. The ranch still stands today, passed down through 5 generations of Katherine and Xander's descendants. The original house has been expanded and modernized, but the bones are still there, solid as the day Xander helped Katherine defend it. And in the family records, carefully preserved, are Katherine's original documentation of Malcolm's fraud and the legal papers that set her free. New generations read those papers and marvel at their great-great-great-grandmother's meticulous record-keeping, her refusal to accept the narrative being forced upon her, her courage to fight back when fighting back could have cost her everything. They learn about Xander, too, the cowboy who arrived at exactly the right moment and chose to involve himself in a stranger's troubles because it was the right thing to do. The story has been written down now, published in family histories and local records. Historians have studied it as an example of how women navigated the legal and social challenges of the Old West, how they fought for their rights when the system was stacked against them. But for Katherine and Xander's descendants, it is more than history. It is proof of where they came from, the strength and love that founded their family, the values they still try to uphold. Sometimes tourists visiting Yreka hear the story and ask to see the ranch. The current generation of Kanes usually obliges, showing visitors around the property and telling the tale of Katherine and Xander. They point out the rise where the couple is buried, the barn Xander built that still stands, the house where Katherine raised her children and grew old beside the man who believed her. And always, they emphasize the central truth of the story, that Katherine was never crazy, no matter what her first husband claimed. She was sane and strong and brave, and Xander Kane was wise enough to see that clearly. Their love was built on that foundation of truth and mutual respect, and it endured because they chose each other freely without the coercion or manipulation that had marked Katherine's first marriage. It is a story about gaslighting before that word existed, about believing women before that phrase became a rallying cry, about how love can heal wounds and partnership can build empires. It is a story very much of its time and yet timeless in its themes. And it remains in the end exactly what it was always meant to be, a fast-paced, heartfelt love story set in the Wild West, about a woman everyone called crazy and the cowboy who knew she was the sanest person in town.